In this video, I will introduce you to the microanatomy of the gastrointestinal tract. We know that the GI tract, or alimentary canal, is a continuous tube from mouth to anus. This particular diagram shows us the variability of the walls and the glands embedded within the different organs of this continuous tube. Specifically, we are looking at the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, and there are a few glands on the back that we'll take a look at as well. Now, no matter where you're looking in the alimentary canal, we're going to see 4 different layers of tissue. First of all, the lining of the lumen of the esophagus all the way down through the colon is made up of epithelial tissue. This is called the mucosa. It's always covered with a certain degree of mucus. Now, this changes as we proceed through the GI tract. Specifically, in the esophagus, we have many layers of these kind of cheaply made cells. This is stratified squamous epithelial tissue, but we can see that in the stomach and throughout the intestines, this is simple columnar epithelial tissue, so much better for secretion and absorption of nutrients. Okay. Deep to the mucosa, we have a layer called the submucosis. So pretty much all of this white right here is called the submucosa. Within the submucosa, we can see that there is a skinny layer of smooth muscle tissue. This skinny layer, no matter where we are looking, is called the Muscularis Mucosa. And essentially, this controls or facilitates the secretion from various glands and crypts and such that are embedded within this submucosal layer. Here we can see an esophageal gland, and so when this Muscularis mucosa is triggered to contract, that muscle squeezes the duct of the esophageal gland, and it deposits its secretions onto the lumen or into the lumen. Okay, again, Muscularis mucosa. The next major layer is this here, and this is the Muscularis Externa. We can see that there are multiple layers of smooth muscle tissue. This one here is the circular layer, and it essentially goes all the way around the tube, right? So all the way around the GI tract, and it has of course here been cut through, it's been sectioned through. Next we have the longitudinal layer, so these smooth muscle cells are essentially oriented along the longitudinal axis of this tube. Now in the stomach itself, there's actually a third layer. It is not shown here. It is called the oblique layer, and that allows the stomach to churn the food that is stored within it, as opposed to just completing segmentation and peristalsis. Now the final layer is called the serosa. Okay, so this connective tissue here is called the serosa. Now let's take a look at some of the other features of this model. In the stomach, we can see that there are little pores here. Right? So these are actually the openings of the gastric pits. The gastric pits are lined with different types of cells that are responsible for secreting things like hydrochloric acid, secreting things like intrinsic factor, as well as some digestive enzymes and such. So these are the gastric pits. They are only located in this section of the model. Moving down to the small intestine, we can see that the lumen of the small intestine is lined with these little finger-like projections. The finger-like projections are called villi, and essentially they are going to increase the surface area for the absorption of nutrients that have been digested within this area of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, at the base here, we'll be able to see this a little better on the other side of the model, but there are also something called intestinal crypts, and they're responsible for essentially replacing the lining of the lumen fairly constantly. There's some immune function, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this, again, is the small intestine, and it is lined with villi, of course, covered by this epithelial tissue of mucosa. And finally, we get down into the large intestine here. We see that there are also these intestinal crypts that are continually secreting mucus. Now remember, in the large intestine, there is a process of dehydration of, at this point, the waste. And so essentially, this is the first place where you're going to be moving relatively dehydrated solid material, and so a lot more mucus lubrication is necessary in this region. Okay, so now let's take a look at the other side of this model. Okay. What we can see at the top are structures that are present within the esophagus. Here we have those esophageal glands. We can also see that there is a lining this lining here of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Moving down, we can see some cells of the stomach. These are those gastric pits, and we can see that there are a variety of different types of cells that are responsible for secreting the gastric secretions as well as hormones. Okay, it's not important to be able to distinguish between these individual cells, but you should know that this is a gastric pit. All right, moving down even further, these are cells that are found within the small intestine, and this is one of those intestinal crypts. Again, a series of cells responsible for immune function, responsible for replacing the lining of the intestines on a regular basis, so stem cells, etc. And finally, we get down all the way to the lard intestine. I do want you to be familiar with this particular cell right here. It is one that you have probably seen before. We can see lots of vesicles chock full of mucin. This here is a goblet cell, and so they are very prevalent within the large intestine in particular because of the fact that the large intestine is moving solid waste.